it's a fake job.
À travers Pénélope, on cherche à me casser.
Kids are involved as well.
Comment l'extrême droite française Marine Le Pen a dévoilé ce week-end à Lyon ses 144 engagements.
Following on from our previous piece from France, 2017 will be a big year for elections across the EU. Italians have just had a constitutional referendum, and they are expected to vote in an election sometime this year, probably in June. That's because Matteo Renzi's government fell after backing the losing side in that referendum. The referendum campaign, like many an electoral process these days, was pockmarked with allegations of misinformation and fake news from both sides. Italian politics has a big new player, a populist party called the Five Star Movement, which is led by a comedian, Beppe Grillo. Like other populist movements, Grillo's relies on anti-establishment rhetoric and a strong social media presence. When accused of trafficking in fake news, rather than putting its hands up, Grillo's movement prefers to point fingers at the Italian mainstream news media, part, Grillo says, of the same establishment his party is out to overthrow. The Listening Post's Paolo Ganino now from Rome on the rise of the Five Star Movement, its media machine, and Italy's battle over fake news.
December 2016. After losing a constitutional referendum he bet his political career on, Matteo Renzi resigned as Italy's prime minister. A few days later, he spoke to his party about the defeat.
Abbiamo perso sul web. Abbiamo totalmente lasciato la parte web nelle mani di chi in queste ore è sotto gli occhi della comunità internazionale, a cominciare dal New York Times, per essere diffusore di falsità.
He was pointing the finger at Italy's main opposition party, the Five Star Movement, which fought against him in the referendum, and its activity online.
Beppe Grillo, the maverick comedian that started the populist movement Five Stars in Italy, simply uses the fake news in order to enhance traffic on his website that is already one of the most popular European websites. They do it on purpose, they do it simply to steer some more revenues. They start sharing them, and then that's when they become radioactive.
The no camp won the referendum by a margin of 20%. Fake news did not determine the referendum result. That said, yes, they did have an impact, especially in spreading hoaxes which were related to the referendum. For example, the hoax claiming that the pencils used in the voting cabins were rigged, and many people believed it. It was one of the most shared stories during the referendum.
Beppe Grillo started his blog in 2005 and saw it grow into one of the 10 most visited in the world. Around that blog, the Five Star Movement has built a sophisticated network of online outlets dealing in news and information. All those affiliated websites are under the same administrative roof, controlled out of Milan by digital consulting firm Casaleggio Associati, which manages the money those sites raise through advertising. It's an informal news network, the existence of which the Five Star Movement denies.
Io sinceramente non ne ho evidenza.
I have no evidence of this constellation of websites. Probably there are some online outlets, but they're not significant in terms of reach, and they have no direct link to the Five Star Movement.
Some evidence is there though, even if it's circumstantial. Those websites share both physical and IP addresses and advertising accounts with official outlets of the Five Star Movement. That online setup was explored extensively by BuzzFeed in the dying days of the referendum campaign, a story the New York Times followed up on. BuzzFeed's report, which said the sites were spreading fake news including Russian propaganda, made headlines. Some of its allegations, though, were a stretch, about articles that were misleading but don't really meet the definition of fake news. Although, Beppe Grillo did post an image from Naples, suggesting it was an anti-government protest, when really the crowd was there to hear the Pope speak. And Zetze, one of Casaleggio's websites, which has more than 1 million Facebook followers, claimed that the US was trafficking migrants into Italy, offering no evidence. On the BuzzFeed allegations, the five-star movement deflects attention away from its own work and onto that of the mainstream media.
It all started when BuzzFeed wrote this article full of factual errors. It was a targeted campaign against us. There can be mistakes, but the great thing about the web is that you can check the source. If you make a mistake, you lose credibility. Someone can call you out immediately. If they had looked into the fake news problem properly, they would have found that the real offenders are the mainstream media.
Italians are turning to the web for alternative news sources, as only 4 in 10 of them consider their mainstream media to be independent. They look at their public broadcaster RAI and see the influence the political parties exert over it. They look at major private TV networks and the many channels still associated with 4-time Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi. And newspapers, well, they're known for their overt bias and their links to the economic establishment. It's no wonder digital outlets, alternative voices, are thriving.
There is a gap of what the mainstream public is interested in and what the mainstream media actually covers. So this sense of detachment from the mainstream media has kind of created a distrust in them, which is a terrible thing to do, because then people flocked to very sketchy websites and believe anything they read on Facebook.
2 settimane prima del referendum, ad esempio...
2 weeks before the referendum, La Stampa, a daily newspaper now owned by Carlo De Benedetti, who also owns La Repubblica, completely invented a story about a Twitter account and a cyber propaganda network aimed at undermining the Democratic Party and opponents of the Five-Star movement. This piece was completely made up. It turned out that the Twitter account wasn't linked to the Five-Star movement after all, but the newspaper never felt the need to admit they reported fake news. They never even acknowledged it. This is a serious problem.
E questa è la cosa grave.
C'è una ostilità che...
There's a hostility towards the Five-Star movement that's really more like a gulf of understanding. In other words, the mainstream media simply don't get them. They struggle to understand what they're about. It's the reason why the US media failed to realize that Trump could win the election, and why the Italian media fails to realize that the Five-Star movement could come first or second in our own elections. Traditional media are not equipped to read how reality is evolving.
Italy's antitrust chief suggested that independent state agencies should have a mandate to police false information on the web. The Five-Star movement proposed an alternative plan, a popular jury to decide on whether what's published in the media is true or false.
Sono due estremi, sono due annunci.
These proposals are two extremes and two sides of the same coin. Political opposition is at the heart of all of this. The government, or a majority party, or the establishment, whichever you prefer, suggests a regulatory commission. So Grillo, who is in the opposition because of how things work, needs to take the opposite view.
Deve fare l'opposto.
Sono tutte e due impraticabili.
Both are unworkable. A people's jury would at best give us the kind of audience juries they have in song contests. And unfortunately, the other historical example are the people's juries in communist countries in Eastern Europe, in which the people had very little to do with it. Tribunals, which would make critics fearful and please the authorities.
Le forze di governo speravano.
With no real solution in sight, and with their media caught in the middle of a political battle, Italian news consumers are left to pay the price. Confused about who to trust, they are retreating to their social media feeds, searching for friendly voices. Whether the stories they find are true, false, or even fake doesn't seem to matter.